As I mentioned, we're taking a look at the story of the wise men and the birth narrative of Jesus today. And let's jump right in. Their story is found in Matthew's Gospel, starting in chapter 2. Jesus was born in Bethlehem and Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. He called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" "In Bethlehem and Judea," they said, "for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd of my people Israel." Then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. Then he told them, "Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child, and when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too." After this interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, because they were super, super rich. When it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. Now, a couple interesting things of note here about this story, which sometimes is lost in all the grandeur and romance of this incredible narrative. One of the really cool things that we're seeing here is that you've got some guys looking up at the stars who see a sign in the heavens, a new star that indicates to them and their belief system that a new king has been born. And based on their projections, that star is sitting over Israel somewhere, so they naturally assume a new king of Israel has been born. Interesting thing for you to know here, these wise men are likely not Jewish, or if they are very broad-minded. They are very inclusive, because if you're a strict Jewish person and a conservative Jewish person, you don't believe in stargazing. Now, there is some evidence that that was part of some of the popular culture stuff, but technically, theologically, in terms of what they really believe, stars are not it. And so what this tells us at the very beginning is that right out of the gate, God is choosing to do something very different than anybody would have expected, that is inclusive and bigger than just one theological view. In essence, Judaism itself. Fascinating. It doesn't discount the specialness of the story that's happening. It doesn't take anything away from anything. All it does is add to it and say, look at that God is choosing to expand and get this message out even to people of other persuasions, other theological positions. And these wise men, we don't know if they were rulers or what, but they had a lot of money. They probably came with a large entourage. You just had to wonder what their conversations were on the way. They brought some really expensive gifts with them. You all have heard about it. You sing the song, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so they're coming ready to impress. They've got their fancy clothes on. They are expecting to have their minds blown. How often do you see a star that indicates a king is born? And they probably can't wait to see what this is going to look like. How big is this palace going to be? How well dressed is this kid going to be? How much gold is going to be on this cradle for this newborn prince? I mean, their expectations had to be so high based on what they believed royalty was going to look like in their culture. And they had to be super excited. So when they get to Jerusalem and find out he's not there, thinking, oh, well, that's the big city, then they find out it's in Bethlehem, just a few miles down the road. And they think to themselves, The prince is born in their country manor. That's where we're going. And so they saddle up again on their fancy Italian camels and head to Bethlehem. They had their expectations, and they were expecting them to be fully met. And instead, they were fully blown. They found out in a hurry that their expectations were wrong, that they'd been climbing up the ladder for sure their whole life, only to find out that it was leaning against the wrong wall. God showed up in a different kind of way to blow their minds and to raise their expectation even as he lowered them. You know, it was about 15 years ago or so, I almost left the ministry to drive a truck or whatever, anything really. And part of the reason is because I was no longer feeling very compelled to talk about it anymore. I kind of felt like a used car salesman. No offense to used car salesmen. I've bought used cars in my life and I appreciate you, okay? But what I mean to say is that sometimes there's this caricatureness of, not quite always above board and just kind of a little, not sleazy, maybe not too much, but you know the caricature I'm talking about, right? And I just felt like I was selling something. And I wasn't that thrilled about it. Just kind of the line that I had sort of been oriented toward, not completely, but enough, was, I'm really selling a ticket to heaven, and I'm just trying to convince people every week that this is the formula you use to get it to happen, and that's the good news, and so here you go. And that wasn't doing much for me anymore. And I just wondered, is that it? Is that really what this whole thing boils down to? And it just so happened that I was finishing up my doctoral work and decided that if I was going to go out, I was going to go out swinging. So I decided to devote my doctoral work to the study of what is this thing all about. And if this thing that we've been talking about can be summed up in the word salvation, because in the Christian vernacular that is, what the heck is that? And is it just about getting your pass to get on the heavenly bus to go to heaven? I wanted to find out. If that's all it was, if that was my expectation being met, then I probably wouldn't be a pastor anymore. I'd be doing anything else. I'm not sure what. Probably selling something else, honestly. But that's not what I found. Instead, through deep study, because I'm a nerd like that, through deep study in the subject of soteriology, that's the fancy word for the study of salvation. Soter in Greek means to save. So I studied deeply this word, what it meant to the Hebrew people, the Jewish tradition, and what it meant in the early Christian tradition. And I want to tell you that my expectations were blown, because it was so much more than I could have ever imagined. I'm still a pastor today, and my faith is still on fire and growing in intensity because of what I found. That it's bigger than I could have imagined. It's more beautiful than I could have imagined. It has the power to change lives to a person and even the whole world. It's incredible and it's compelling. I think a similar thing happened for those wise men that day. Those nerds who saw the signs in the sky and believed that a new king had been born and came with their expectations, this is how this thing's going to go, and they got all fancied up and made sure they brushed their teeth and stuff before they headed to Bethlehem to make a good impression. Once they got there, I think they were speechless. I think whatever speech they had planned suddenly just didn't matter. Because when they were given really specific directions on where to find this baby people had been talking about, and they found out it was a cave, and not just a cave to feed their camels, but that the baby was in there, well, who could have expected that? It's interesting because there's no way, this cave was probably like a cutout in the side of a hill, right? That could have been man-made. And probably the entrance to this cave may have been 4 feet high, maybe more, but probably not, because you didn't want it to be that high, because you wanted to be able to close it up pretty easy, and you didn't want it to be very big because you wanted to be able to protect your animals who were inside with you, sleeping inside the cave if you were their shepherd. And so in order for these wise men, these really rich dudes in their fancy clothes, driving their fancy Italian camels, in order for them to even lay eyes on the Christ child, the God with us kid, this Emmanuel, they had to get off their camels. The baby didn't care about their camels. And in fact, it was more than that. They recognized pretty quick that their fancy hats that they bought just for this occasion were not going to be able to fit through that entrance. So they had to take off their fancy hats. And as they got closer and closer to the entrance to the cave, they realized also that they were not going to be able to get in to see this little kid unless they bowed down, practically crawling in on their hands and knees to catch a glimpse. The God who gave a sign in the stars did not show up in a baby in a palace in a gilded cradle, fulfilling all cultural expectations of what success is supposed to look like, and instead chose to come in the most humble of circumstances to make a great point. That God is found not in riches. God is found in humility. Furthermore, God is not terribly impressed with riches and wealth and title and prestige and power and all of that. God already has all that. But what does impress God is humility. You know, I think for a lot of us, that's really great news. That's really great news. Some of us even have been told, there are even theological traditions that say your favor from God can be shown in your wealth. We call them, in my world, health and wealth gospel ministries. There are people, pastors like me, who have a ridiculous sum of money that they have somehow gleaned from their congregants, because they've said, if you just name it and claim it enough, then God will make you rich too, as if that was the point. Thank God it's not. Thank God the Christ child was born in a manger, because that tells everybody everywhere that's not what it's about. That your wealth, your status, your stature, your titles, all that stuff is meaningless in terms of your value as a person and your value in the eyes of God. I talked a lot about this last week with the shepherds, so I won't go into that too much today, but just own that again, because I know that there really are theological views out there that are still peddling that garbage. That you know you're blessed by God if you are financially blessed by God. And that's just not it. God showed up in this baby in a manger. Emmanuel was in a cave. And it smelled like crap, because there was dung on the floor of the cave. That's where God showed up in humility. And the only way these fancy dudes, who, by the way, were humble enough to heed the sign in the sky, who were humble enough to want to actually go visit this thing, humble enough to get off their camels, humble enough to take off their fancy hats, and humble enough to bend down in. So these guys were learning the lesson on the way. They were humble enough to bow down and worship this child. Now, what does that word worship mean? Did they start singing a song? Did they pray to this child? No. Worship simply means to show the worth of something. And so by them coming in and doing all this, they are saying to Mary and Joseph and the baby and the goats and the sheep and the chickens, this child is worth laying down all of that. This is where the truth lies. That was the case back then, and it hasn't changed to today. I don't know what you're going through in life, but my hunch is, in this COVID reality, we are really aware of how quickly our resources can dry up. We're very aware of how quickly our health can be taken from us. We're very aware how the economy of one of the world's greatest economies can struggle from something we can't even see being transmitted in the air. And it is a reminder to be humble, to keep grounded, to keep your eye on what actually matters, and realize that this is actually the truth, that we see God not through our pride, not through our puffed upness, not because we have a good bank account, not because we have the right pedigree or we have the right address. We see God when we choose to become humble. And I would say the opposite is true too. I think we fail to see, hear, experience God when we are so full of ourselves that there is no room for God to speak or be seen or to be felt. So the message we get from this story today, the lesson we learn from these wise men: get off your high horse, get off your high camel. Decide where value really is. Decide what really matters. Get over yourself. Get over yourself to crawl into the manger and see this child where God resides. Look into the face of that child and see yourself reflected in that, because that's where your real worth is. That's where it really matters. And when we have that, we are then able to be much more free with whatever other stuff we have, and not feel pressured by the culture around us to fall into that trap again, but to actually use all that stuff for something much better than just a nicer car or a bigger house or a little bit more money in our account. There are bigger and better things to do with our stuff. We only realize that when we're humble enough to listen and to find out. These guys stayed humble, by the way. Once they got out of that cave and got their fancy hat back on and got back up on their high camel and started to make their way, they heard the voice of God tell them to go back a different direction, to not go back to the king and tell him where they found this kid. They didn't know why. They just listened to the voice because they were still humble enough to hear it. They didn't know what that meant either. The way, if we play this story out, that bought Mary and Joseph and Jesus time. Because if they would have gone back to Jerusalem that night and given the address, Jesus would have been killed the very next day. Instead, because they were humble enough just to follow what God was going to do, not knowing all the ways that that was going to have an impact on their world, they actually gave the world a great gift. In a strange way, these foreigners with a foreign religion, in a strange way, their humility gave the gift of Jesus to the world because they allowed him to live and be known to future generations. They didn't know they were doing that. They were just humble enough to hear the voice of God and follow. May you, mostly Americans listening to this, I would imagine, different levels of wealth, but still living in the world's superpower, may you realize that your real value is not in your money, not in your titles, not in your health, not in your nationality, and not in your citizenship. But your real value is who you are as a child of God. You are deeply loved. You have deep inherent value. Live into that. Say yes to the invitation to follow that star. Say yes to the invitation to get off your high camel. Say yes to the invitation to take off your fancy hat. Say yes to the invitation to bow so that you can make it into the cave. Say yes to the invitation to go a different path than you intended, because you're hearing God invite you toward that, because you have no idea what it's going to do for you and the rest of your world. Wow. Take that. The Lord's Prayer is one big yes to all of that. Let's pray it together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Have a great week.